Welcome, everybody. Thursday afternoon, high-level week. Congratulations, compliments to your stamina, each one of you. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my privilege to welcome you all to this special event, the G20 and the Reform of Global Economic Governance Structures. We're especially pleased to organize this in partnership with our colleagues from G20 Social and the Brazilian G20 Presidency. Many thanks to them and to all of you who have joined us this afternoon. As we all know, the world is, to say the least, facing a broad range of multifaceted challenges, from persistent economic instability to climate emergencies, geopolitical tensions, violent conflict, and growing inequality. It seems all of this is on display this week and in this very neighborhood in the conversations that we've been having all week. There is an urgent need to make our global governance structures fit for purpose to address all of these crises. At the heart of this challenge is the pressing need to reform our global governance, economic governance institutions, including the G20, the International Monetary Fund, multilateral development banks, and other international financial institutions. Reform, of course, must focus on making these institutions more effective in delivering real, impactful solutions to the crises we face. But this can only happen if these institutions become more inclusive and democratic in their operations and governance. This includes ensuring balanced gender and regional representation, and crucially, expanding opportunities for non-governmental stakeholders to have a voice in decision-making processes. Earlier this week, member states met at the Summit of the Future and agreed on a pact with, can we say, reasonably strong language addressing IFA reforms and a list of practical action items to align economic reform with the need to accelerate achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and take necessary climate action, among other global priorities. But by most accounts, it was a highly contentious debate and negotiation, which leaves much work to be done. It is in this context that we are really very pleased to have this opportunity to further engage on these issues with key representatives from the Brazilian G20 Presidency, which, to their complement, has prioritized these critical reforms. Today's forum will allow us to reflect on the successes and lessons learned from the past year and explore what lies ahead as we collectively push for a reimagined global governance structure that is both more accountable and more equitable. I look forward to hearing from our esteemed panelists, which we'll turn to shortly, as they share perspectives on the path forward for the G20 and other international financial institutions. This discussion is not only timely, but it is essential, as the decisions made at the G20 and beyond, I think we all can agree, will have far-reaching implications for global economic stability and equity in the months and years ahead. With that, it is my real, genuine pleasure to turn the floor over to Fernanda Santiago, Special Advisor to the Minister of Finance and Attorney General of the Ministry of Finance of Brazil. Welcome to IPI. Please, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a great honor to represent the Brazilian Minister of Finance at this G20 social meeting. I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to the International Peace Institute for hosting this important event. A special thanks to Adam Lupel, Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at IPI, for your kind words and warm reception. And to your entire team, particularly Gemma Roshi, for all the invaluable support in making this gathering possible. This meeting is part of the G20 Social Finance Track Initiative, which under Brazil's presidency aims to enhance social participation across the G20 work stream. Our goal is to strengthen engagement between various stakeholders groups and to invite global civil society organizations to actively participate in our activities. Within the Ministry of Finance, the Secretariat for International Affairs has established a dedicated team to oversee the G20 Social in the finance track. Since December 2023, this team has worked to create meaningful spaces for dialogue with civil society, enabling exchanges with government representatives responsible for key finance tracking working groups and initiatives, and take part in activities organized by engagement groups and other non-governmental organizations. The G20 Social in the Finance Track has already undertaken initiatives aligned with Brazil's priority, including addressing inequalities, international taxation, the just transition, and gender equality. For instance, at the fourth Finance and Central Bank Deputies FCBD meeting in Rio de Janeiro on July 22, 2024, we hosted a G20 social session that fostered dialogue between civil society engagement groups and finance and central bank deputies. This represented a significant milestone in advancing social participation within the G20, a priority for Brazil's presidency. Global governance reform is another cornerstone of President Lula's administration. The global economy has evolved dramatically over the last few decades, marked by the expansion of trade, global value chains, and digitalization. These changes call for a reformed global governance system that is better suited for our times. For Minister Fernando Haddad, this reform agenda is centered around international taxation. Taxing the super-rich is a pivotal measure to generate resources to combat hunger and inequality, while also tackling tax evasion and avoidance, which disproportionately benefit billionaires. Further details on additional priorities, including a new multilateralism structure, a revised quota formula for IMF, a roadmap for the reform of multilateral development banks, and the importance of gender and geographic balancing in representation will be presented by my esteemed colleagues. I hope this event is a resounding success and thank all the speakers and attendees for their participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernanda and Mrs. Adam Lupel, the International Peace Institute for holding and for giving this all the support to have this event. I'm Tatiana Berringer. I'm the General Coordinator for G20 Social at Finance Track. And I'm very happy to be here with you. We have 5 panelists, 3 of them, Flávio Pazeto, Bruno Saraiva, and Karen, came from Brazilian government. The idea that they can present to you in terms of accountability and transparency, how Brazilian presidents has led with this specific team of global governance reform. And then we will have, and I'm very glad to have here, Cristina Duarte from Africa continent to give their perspective on that, and Jehu, who will give us an Asia perspective. After their speech, I will open to some questions of our audience. Okay, so thank you very much. Now I call Flávio Pazeto. He's the first secretary of the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the responsible for the general coordination of the G20.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Thanks to Adam for hosting us here. Thank you very much to Fernanda for your beautiful opening remarks on behalf of Brazil's Finance Ministry. I'll try to be brief here. I'm Flavio. I work in the G20 Sherpa office in Brazil. Brazil is the chair country of the G20 this year. I'll try to very briefly answer two questions. Why global governance reform? Why, in our perspective, it is needed, and what is the Brazilian G20 contribution to the reform of global governance? I'll try to answer the second question in more broad terms, as I would say that Bruno and Karin will be able to do so in more specific terms in relation to the global economic governance structures. Brazil selected three general priorities for its G20 presidency, so fighting hunger and poverty, the pandemic added 120, 130 million people more to the list of, prior to the pandemic, 600 million people starving, suffering from hunger. So this is a top priority for the Brazilian G20 presidency, the number one priority. Fighting climate change and promoting sustainable development, the second one, and promoting global governance reform. So why global governance reform? In our perspective, global governance reform is needed because in the way we see it, the way we see the UN, the way we see the Bretton Woods institution, the way we see the WTO, these institutions are not anymore fit for purpose. They are not anymore fit to face the challenges that we identify as central in today's world, which is hunger and poverty, climate change, and wars and conflicts. We have a record number of wars and conflicts nowadays. According to IISS, 183 conflicts last year, which is a Cold War era figure for wars and conflict. Do we have the international institutions, structures fit to face these challenges? We need to face climate change. Do we have a reference to climate or to environment in the UN Charter? We don't. There's no reference to the environment, not even climate, to the environment in the Charter. So we see the institutions, let's say, unfit to face these challenges. Bruno and Karin later will say more about the MDBs and the IMF, but as a general point, the quest here is that we should be working together, these 20 biggest economies, to reform these institutions and make them fit for purpose once again. And the second question, what is the Brazilian G20 contribution to the global governance reform? I would say, from the Sherpa perspective, from the perspective of, let's say, the political framework managing G20, the biggest contribution has been a certain normalization of the G20. It is an uncomfortable normalization of the G20 because of the context. We are managing the G20, we're chairing the G20 in a context in which one of the members, a central member, breached international law in 2022 by invading another country, a neighboring country. This is challenging. Brazil is one of the countries that it's the only BRICS country that states that says it clearly, that Russia violated international law by invading a neighboring country. But Brazil is not a NATO member. Brazil does not supply weapons to Ukraine, and Brazil has kept regular diplomatic relations with Russia. That puts us in a, I would say, special position in which we can try to normalize G20. Why am I referring to the normalization of the G20? Since 2021, since before the war started in Ukraine, the G20 has not issued one single ministerial declaration. We had to negotiate a special arrangement in July for the group to resume issuing ministerial declarations. That was done. Yesterday, we had the second G20 foreign ministers meeting here in New York, the first one inside the UN, the first one open to all UN members. For the first time, we managed to have a joint consensual document of all G20 foreign ministers. This is the first time that we managed to have that. It's a type of normalization, as I said, an uncomfortable normalization because there is one member in the group breaching international law, but we think it's something valid. We need to have the G20 once again operating as a global governance group for us to be able to tackle this, let's say, finalistic, these main priorities of tackling climate change, facing hunger and poverty, and reforming the institutions that we need for our common future ahead. I will not say more. Maybe we can reserve more time to Q&A. And thank you very much, Tatiana.
Thank you very much, Flavio, and congratulations for yesterday meeting. It was really, really a milestone. Now I call Bruno Saraiva, the alternate executive director for Brazilian IMF's office. Thank you.
Thanks, Tatiana, and let me thank the organizers for putting together this event and inviting me to participate in this important discussion. Well, I have to start with a disclaimer. I speak here on my own voice. I do not speak on behalf of the IMF Executive Board, and I won't be able to disclose any information that has not been made public officially. So luckily, there are no secrets regarding this discussion at the fund, because basically, since the approval of the 16th, okay. Oh. All right, it's probably better now. But since the approval of the 16th General Review of Quota at the end of last year, we haven't discussed much about the 17th General Review of Quotas, even though there is a deadline for next year, as we're going to see later. I'll focus on the fund, on the exactly the issue of the IMF governance. And I believe that many of you have already heard that the IMF is a quota-based institution. And the first question is exactly what does that mean? And indeed, quotas are at the very cornerstone of IMF finance and governance. And that relates to the multiple roles that quotas play within the fund. First, quotas determine how much each member contributes financially to the cooperative. Secondly, quotas define access limits in IMF lending, and also whether a member will be paying surcharges or not. I mean, this issue of surcharges have been came as a very big issue of discussion, including among the civil society. Third, quotas determine the distribution of SDRs in the general allocation. We had recently, in the context of COVID, a very big allocation of SDRs. And at the end of the day, the distribution was completely tilted because most of the SDRs went to the richer countries, the ones that did not need that allocation. And finally, quotas determine the voting power of each member. And this is the focus of, what I wanted to bring here for the discussion. And starting with the question of how power in a multilateral institution like the IMF should be distributed, and how can we move the needle in the right direction. I just mentioned that, most of the quotas are with advanced economies, and of course, therefore, most of the power at the fund is held by these economies. And we had a big moment like 12 years ago or so, or 15 to 12 years ago, just after the global financial crisis. There was a very specific juncture in which emerging markets and developing economies, let's say, had a favorable moment. It was a sweet spot for the EMDEs. The crisis hit mainly advanced economies. We had, the MDEs growing at a very robust pace for quite a while. Commodity prices were high. BRICS, which was a kind of a idea that came more or less out of nothing, became a reality. And the US was also concerned with Europe, and Europe in this context of the IMF is, plays an important role because it has a very large chunk of the quotas and therefore of the voting power. But this is not a juncture that we have now, and not one that is very easily repeated as we move forward. It's a kind of an alignment of stars. And basically, in that moment, what we managed to do was to shift voting power, about 6% of the voting power, in the direction of quota shares in the direction of the dynamic EMDEs, reduce 2 European chairs. This was not completed, something that we could discuss afterwards, and protect the quota shares of the poorest members. But since then, basically, the governance reform momentum has stalled. And what we have seen this year, when Brazil tried to push the discussion of IMF governance reform, as, for example, when this issue was brought to the International Financial Architecture Working Group in Seoul a couple of weeks ago, there was a lot of resistance, not much of a consensus on where should we be moving to. There is this discussion that, which is kind of tautological, that the place for this discussion to happen and for the decision to be taken is the IMF Executive Board. But the fact is, in order for the IMF board to change the governance structure that will affect the IMF board itself, there needs to be some pressure coming from outside. And this pressure coming from outside, the G20 in the past, as I said, in that moment, played a very important role to push for the IMF governance reform of that time. And the civil society as well has an important role to play. Yeah, unfortunately, I think that my time is over. I didn't bring like the main examples that I would like to share with you in terms of the distortions that we have in terms of quota shares at the fund, which is very amazing, I would say. But basically, just to close with a broad example, while emerging market and developing economies today respond for like 60% of the global economy, they only have 40% of the shares. So this is a situation that should not remain much longer, because that undermines the legitimacy of a multilateral institution like the fund. Sorry, I'll have to save some for the discussion if you have questions. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm sorry to control the time. Now I give the floor to Karen Costa Vasquez, General Coordinator for Multilateral Development Banks Reform on the Finance Track at the Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, and I know you're in the hot seat controlling time. I'll try to be brief and state from the very outset and remind ourselves that we are at a very critical point in time. In 2015, our countries agreed with the 2030 Development Agenda and 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and more than half point into the development agenda, we are lagging behind our commitments. Less than 17% of the SDGs are on track, and not only the gap in the implementation, we also have a very serious gap in financing these commitments. And this gap is increasing. 2 years ago, we had a 2.5 trillion in this financing gap for the for the SDGs, and now this gap is 4 trillion US dollars in this year. how can we address this issue within our broader discussion of international financial architecture reform? And here I would like to zoom in into the role of the multilateral development banks, which the Brazilian presidency sees as having a critical role in bridging this gap, which I mentioned. Not only with financing, which is usually the first thing that we think when we hear about the multilateral development banks, but we are also talking about knowledge. We are also talking about the convening power that these banks have in bringing the different actors to work jointly on solutions. Having this very clear in mind, the G20 presidency is committed to strengthening the role of the multilateral development banks in the broader IFA, International Financial Architecture, reform discussion, precisely to help countries achieve their SDGs. Flavio, my colleague Flavio, has already mentioned about the initiatives that are being taken under the Sherpas track. In the finance track, one of the key initiatives that we were taking forward is a G20 roadmap for better, bigger, and more effective MDBs. And why is this roadmap so important for our Brazilian presidency and hopefully also a legacy for the G20 members and the MDB system and the role? Because it's the first document that it's being produced by major MDB shareholders, setting the priorities for enhancing MDB support to countries in achieving their SDGs. So the roadmap, which is currently being finalized, it contains a set of recommendations and actions that the G20 members agree to commit to implement with the aim of three goals. The first one, increase access to MDB financing. The second one, increasing the MDB lending capacity. And the third one, increasing impact. The roadmap has been developed throughout this year in a very collaborative and inclusive process, building on the work done by previous G20 presidencies. So the Italian presidency, the great work on CAF reform, which was taken forward by the Indonesian and the Indian presidency, the IEG report, also the work that the MDBs themselves have been doing together as a system, and the individual initiatives being taken forward by the different MDBs, but also in consultation with the think tanks, with the experts, with the civil society community. And we expect the roadmap to be approved at the 4th Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting in Washington, D.C. At the end of October. So very briefly, some of the recommendations and actions in the roadmap to give you a flavor of what I'm talking about in practice. So as I mentioned before, CAF implementation, the capital adequacy framework recommendations, is certainly one of the recommendations that we were taking forward. This year, our reports found that by implementing CAF recommendations, the MDBs increasing their lending headroom capacity in $357 billion over the next decade. This was an improvement compared to last year, which was $200 billion. So we already find gains in terms of the additional financing capacity that the MDBs are having by implementing the recommendations that were put forward 3 years ago by the G20 members, but also encouraging recommendations around financial innovations on hybrid capital, recommendations on 5 minutes. I'm very happy. I thought it was 1 minute. I didn't want to look at it. 2 minutes, great. MDBs working as a system, not only amongst themselves, but also how the MDB system connects with the system of public development banks at the national and subnational level through country platforms, foreign exchange risk mitigation, and use of local currency. So there is also recommendations on this topic, and increasing gender and regional representation in MDBs. And here is a very dear point for Tatiana. Perhaps I get 30 seconds extra bonus for that, in which we see from different reports that 70% of the administrative positions of the positions are mainly in administrative, of the total positions in the MDBs are filled by women, mainly in administrative positions. So the higher you go up in the institutional hierarchy, the fewer women we see filling in these positions. And in the specific case of the World Bank, reports indicate that the percentage of women in top positions fell from 40 to 20% over the last 2 years. And this is across the board. It's not only about one or two institutions. We have found this across the IFIs. And in addition to the roadmap, the G20 Presidency is also developing a note on representation of top IFI positions. And some interesting facts, this note will be presented also in October to the ministers, but I'm going to give you a flavor of what it contains. 14 IFIs that were surveyed confirmed the significant and concerning underrepresentation of women in top positions and top management positions in several IFIs, despite a few exceptions. The survey also found that typically IFIs value merit and diversity in selection of top positions and top management, but these principles are often enshrined, rarely enshrined at the highest charters of the IFI, and there are no binding mechanisms for their implementation. So there is a lot of goodwill, but still little results that we need to work on. Going forward, as we're at the General Assembly, and this is my last point, and discussions on the Pact of the Future and the upcoming process of the Financing for Development Forum and the upcoming presidency of South Africa in the G20, there is an opportunity ahead of us to really look into the synergies across these different spaces, discuss international financial architecture reform, MDB reform to drive concrete action. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Now I give the floor to Cristina Duarte, Under Secretary General and Special Advisor on Africa at the UN Office of the Special Advisor on Africa.
Good afternoon. I have 5 minutes, so all protocols observed. Basically, I'm trying to transmit a couple of ideas, a paper that I wrote for Columbia University about global governance reform and what are the challenges. So allow me just to jump. We do have a challenge based on what Bruno Saraiva said. I was Minister of Finance from 2006 and 2016, fighting for IMF reforms for 10 years. Ask me what I got or what we got. Cosmetic. Just cosmetic. And this is our challenge because we cannot fight for chairs. Chairs is just a means to reach something else, to reach new mechanisms of sharing power. If you get a chair, but not a seat, oh, you are in trouble. Because then you might enter in a game of mutual accountability where you have no voice and you validate their positions. This is very risky. So basically, we at the UN, we are ready to support the Global South. I would like to say that up front. And what I would like to bring, and in order for this this fight, allow me to say in this way, global governance reform, not to end up in getting a chair and everybody's happy, we need to understand the dynamics between globalization and multilateralism. If you do not understand, you'll be getting a chair and nothing else. And allow me very quickly by first saying that globalization is, poverty alleviation is not DNA, is not in the DNA's globalization. Let's recognize. Second, poverty alleviation is a byproduct of globalization by chance. So it's not the driver. It's not the driver. As everybody knows, the mechanism of globalization creates a spiral of investment, reinvestment, and essentially driven by profit. So we need to understand that the root cause why inequalities have been growing at a global level, regional level, and country level is because globalization by itself does not have check and balances. Does not have check and balances. And the globalization needs to look for check and balance outside globalization. I used to say that globalization, if left unchecked, is a mechanism that perpetuates and generates imbalance. Then comes multilateralism. What is the role of multilateralism in this globalization journey? And if we look back in the past 30 years, 40 years, if you notice, multilateralism has been essentially playing two functions in terms of serving globalization. And we need to understand these two functions because they're completely different. Let me start for the first one. I call in my paper, when multilateralism plays the paving the way to globalization function. Who plays this role? Let's be clear. World Trade Organization, IMF and World Bank. And they have been playing that function very efficient, very efficient. By 2008, if I'm not, or 2018, global trades through global value chains were more than 60%. So, and this is one of the functions that multilateral has been providing to globalization. What is the second function? Addressing globalization imbalances. I used to say the cleaning function. And in this addressing globalization imbalance, unfortunately, we have not been efficient. My apologies to disappoint you. We have not been efficient at all. And in fact, who plays this second function, addressing globalization imbalances? We as UN system, the European Union cooperation mechanisms, and so on. And what happened in the past 40 years? The first function, paving the way to globalization, has crowded out the second function. UN system is broken. No money to take care of the imbalances. Let's talk clear. So the first function has been crowding out the second function, the taking care of the imbalance function. And what is the result? First, a huge deficit in regulatory. No regulation, and I'm about to finish. No regulation at all, and I can go in more detail. Absent of global political leadership, inefficient multilateral process. Multilateral organizations are often paralyzed by inefficient decision-making process and erosion of trust in institutions. The question is, if we do not rescue the second function, we will not be able to reform the global governance. As simple as that. As simple as that. So what are we doing to rescue the second function? And here comes the UN 2.0, very quickly, and I will finish on this. The UN 2.0 basically is approaching this global governance conversation from a supply side and demand side. Supply side is top-down. It's basically what the Secretary General has been saying. To reform the international financial architecture, the SDG stimulus, the need to reform the MDGs, and go on, all that agenda. This is the supply side, top-down. But if we don't put in motion the bottom-up, let's say, work stream, we'll not get there, which means the demand side. We need to go to, in this case of African countries, is the missing voice in this puzzle. We need to work with the African countries to try to increase their economic power, the demand-driven, because we know at the end of the day, the global governance is a result of correlation of forces. If you do not work the supply side together with the demand side and to empower, in my case, because I'm the special advisor in Africa, I'm supposed to talk about African countries, to empower African countries, will not be able to change the correlation and forces. This is the reason that me and my team in the past 40 years, and this is my last sentence, we developed a quite strong and bold narrative that I had the opportunity to deliver. I don't know when, Adam, I'm sorry. I have been talking. So from a financing standpoint, we need to understand why Africa is at the same time losing $500 billion and at the same time begging for money. This is the problem. We need to understand. And where is the root cause of the problem? And the root cause of the problem is because we do not have domestic resource mobilization systems strong. And since you don't have DRM systems, you do not control our economic and financial flows. And this is the reason we are in this paradox situation, begging for money and losing 500 billion money. I hope I did not go above my 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cristina. Now I call Jerubili Moria, founder of One Family Foundation, co-founder of Catalyst 2030. Please, the floor is yours. And as soon as she finishes, she needs to leave to have replied it. No?
Thank you very much for having me over here. I'm going to give the voice of civil society. I think everyone has said global governance is not doing a great job and our multilateral institutions are failing. But maybe we need to look at why. As was said, I think the reason is there is no voice for civil society. There's a lot, you said, we have a chair, we don't have a seat. If we don't have a seat at the table, we are not going to be able to make a shift. But more importantly, even more than civil society, are we really listening to the really poorest of the poor? Are we really listening to the child on the street, the hungry people in the villages? No, we are not. So I think if we have to have true global governance reform, we need to restructure how we are getting information. And next time when we do the Sustainable Development Goals or any version of that, we need to leverage technology to understand what the poorest of the poor really want and then start redefining. Because otherwise, every change that we are making is totally incremental. It is one small step at a time. And I understand we have a building, we are trying to renovate it. But the honest fact is the building is crumbling. So maybe we need to look at global governance in such a way that we knock down everything and try to rebuild with a very different, strong foundation. I think what Brazil has done with G20 Social is really good. I really love that idea. But what I would love in G20 Social is that instead of having multiple engagement groups and governments here and this year, we all sat together and we started talking. And we leverage data to be able to get what is coming from the communities so that we really have the voices, the people's voices from the communities in the room. And I don't mean it tokenistically. Huh? I think there are enough platforms today to be able to do it. So I think if we are able to do it, then we need to relook at how do we need to shift economy. One of the biggest tensions and why we have conflicts and the underlying cause of conflicts are our economic paradigms. We have communism, we have socialism, we have social communism, or we can go into any number of isms. But if we shifted away from those economic paradigms and stuck to these what I think very outdated ideologies and started redefining, and I think G20 Social actually can start that redefinition, is by saying, let's look at a new economic paradigm, an economic paradigm which is just focusing on two main things, the people and the planet. And let's make it much, much simpler on how we want to do it. How are we looking at people? Are we able to make life easier for people? And we can have a standard set of questions. I'm not going into that in 5 minutes. We are looking at planet. How are we going to be able to do that? I'm not going in the details, but can we redefine our whole thinking of economy and see how we are able to do it? My last point, which I'm going to say is, let's break away from traditional structures and let's RAS reimagining. because that's the only way we are going to be able to bring about a shift. So if global governance has to shift, we need to shift our mindsets. And I've heard a lot on this panel, but I'm really trying to look at where is the mindset shift in all of this. And for me, if G20 Social can start the process of mindset shift, the process of getting global institutions, which we talked a lot about, IMF, World Bank, everything, having those institutions to start rethinking how they are doing the work, I think we will be able to shift global governance. And we will be able to really break down the barriers which are currently there. That's all I'm going to say. The last point I'm going to point to is Marcel and Monica. We are part of G20 for Impact, which Catalyst 2030 is, which is actually promoting this as a resolution. So I think hopefully G20 will take it on and we'll be able to relook at it and have a new structure. And bang on the dot of my 5 minutes, I finish over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you for all the panelists. Now I will open for Q&A session, and I will invite Luis Vieira from Bretton Woods Project to start this momentum, please. Then we have Henrique Frota from Abong Incio and C20. So please, Luis. And who else, raise your hand, then Elder will collect your names and make the list, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the floor, and thank you for all the panelists. I won't ask a question. My understanding is I was to provide some insights from Global Civil Society from the North. I'm Luis Vieira from the Bretton Woods Project, based in London. I just want to make a couple very quick comments. Is that?
Yes.
Okay, yes. So the first thing I'd like to contextualize, is great to have the Pact for the Future. However, just a reminder that the General Assembly resolution on the new economic order was passed in 1974, 40 years today. We've been talking about architecture reform for a long time, and it's like a constant theme. And there's been some progress, but as was noted before, the progress is lacking. And then, I'd like to make a point about the urgency and link this to the fact that, to the minister's point, we talked about climate, we talked about conflict, et cetera. But one of the things that underlies all of this is the crisis of development. The World Bank, the new World Development Report called the middle income trap. Very few countries have jumped from middle income to high income. The IDA graduation rates are extremely low. So we're talking about a crisis of development. We're talking about the fact that the multilateral system is not only unable to meet the challenges of the future, the climate change, violent conflicts, but it hasn't been able to meet the aspirations of the people, right, which is development. That's what I think we need to recontextualize discussion about development and human rights. And the system has not been able to deliver. And then my final point is that, we do have a forum where countries have one vote, one voice, and that's the UN system. We really need to, and we're arguing for this, for the recalibration of the power to shift away from the bank and the fund and go to the UN system, for example, via the Financing for Development Conference in next year. And my final point is that vis-a-vis the urgency, I went to a panel yesterday called Injustice, Social Unrest, and the Erosion of Democracy. The failing of the multilateral system is not some esoteric discussion. It's the impacts of those impact not only low and middle income countries, but impacts democracies in Europe and North America, Japan, and et cetera. So, everyone talks about the rise of the far right and populist movements. These things are not disconnected. And we must address not only imbalances of the global north and south, but also the imbalance between the non-state actors, finance and big tech, and states. So those are the challenges that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. Henrique.
Good afternoon. As Tatiana presented me, my name is Henrique. I'm chairing Civil 20 this year, the engagement group for civil society on G20. And I would like to ask you, how about are the negotiations about debt within G20 countries? we know by the last report by UNCTAD this year that we have 48 developing countries spending more on interest payments than on health and education. It's about 3.3 billion people in the world living in countries that spend more to pay debt than invests on health and education. We can also talk about hunger, poverty, food insecurity. Most of these countries are on Africa, but also Asia and Latin America. And since the pandemic, we talked about on how we can make debt swaps, especially debt to health, now debt to climate. Last week, I heard from Ambassador Mauricio Lirio, how could we also make debt to food security? But we really don't know how this conversation has been done within the G20 countries this year. So I would like to ask you about that. And also the problem of credit rating. It's not transparent. Who are the actors? Normally private. Normally they serve on speculation. So I'm asking these two issues because they are really related to the capacity of the countries to invest in social rights and human rights in the territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrique Erlei, for FE20, the new engagement group for favelas in Brazil.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erlei from Brazil. I am here to represent F20 with my colleague, Gabriela Santos. So we understand that global reform is very important for a lot of communities around the world and G20's countries, all right? So I would like to make quickly questions. I would like to know how the Brazilian president of G20 makes mechanisms to involve the favela and the vulnerable communities in the global reform discussions, because I understand the importance to involve these people and different voices in the global reform. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Erlei. Jimena from IPI, please.
Thank you very much. And this all started with Adam and I traveling to Brasilia and going to a G20 social meeting and kind of falling in love with the process of having a much bigger role for civil society within the G20. So we kind of fell in love with this concept and we really want to push it as part of like the process for all G20 presidencies. So thank you so much. I have 3 questions. My first one is, if you can, Flavio, if you can tell us more a little bit about the uncomfortable normalization of the G20. It was great that you adopted a declaration yesterday. And where do you see the biggest opportunities for the meeting in November? The wealth tax, climate, like where do you see that can be your biggest legacy and how can we push that? Then I am already a fan of USG Duarte, and you said that chair is not a seat. And I would love it if you can expand on that and how we can really achieve real power for the South beyond just asking for a seat. And the third question is for Bruno on SDRs. We at IPI with Michael and others, we've advocated for an administrative account for climate on IMF. And so we want to know what's the likelihood of SDR disbursement for climate and for development. Thank you.
Okay, now we have Beth. She's from NTU SIC, please.
Sorry. I recognize my own name. Thank you very much.
Switch off? Oh, I'm sorry. So again, Betty Wainaina from the New York University Center on International Cooperation. I really thank IPI for putting together this conversation. I think it's very, very important. And to congratulate Brazil during your presidency of the G20. I think with the 3 countries from the global south that have been part of the G20 presidency, we've seen a lot of moving and sort of shifting the envelope quite a bit with regards to MDB reform. I just want to raise 2 points. One on the agenda around bigger, better MDBs. And I think one of the things we've heard, especially around bigger MDBs, is that really it's about the capital adequacy framework. It's about leveraging on private financing. But there's really very little commitment, actually, from donors to recapitalize MDBs. And I think if we want to safeguard the concessional characteristic of MDB financing, we really can't avoid the fact that donors need to put more money into MDBs. The second thing is really for IMF, and Saraiva, really what you're saying, I completely support you. But I think we need to have a conversation around the role of the IMF as the principal entity for the global financial safety net for the weaker countries, for countries that are poor, countries that are not able to have their own safety net within their own reserves, or to participate in regional mechanisms as part of the global financial safety net. So the IMF really is the organization that can do that. But I think until now, IMF has really failed in playing that role. If we look at the crisis and the extent to which countries are unable to deal with the shocks that they're experiencing, I think the conversation around the role that IMF plays is very important. And it's not only about the SDRs, it's really about the principle of having, of the IMF playing the role as a global financial safety net. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth. And our last question came from the online audience, Alessandro Motter. Can the panel, I think it's a good question to be the last one. Can the panel explain what is the value added of the G20 versus the UN? Would it not help make an economic governance more effective if the G20 was simply an informal group of member states at the UN who caucus together to support official UN decisions, beginning with those of financial for development process? So now I will back to our panelists. Do you want to start?
Yes, because I need to leave.
Yeah, okay, Christina, please, you have the floor.
No. I would like to, my apologies, I need to leave, I have another meeting. I would like to stress that the UN system role. We are realizing that our main comparative advantage is not financial resources. The money in the world, the trillions, are not in the system. The trillions are not even in the national budgets. We need to realize that. We need to ask ourselves, where is the money? If we want to unlock SDG implementation. And the money, as we speak today, is with the private sector in general. Not only multinational, but financial system. This is where is the money. So this is the reason that the reform led by the Secretary General, the UN 2.0, is exactly the reform that wants to place the UN system first in the position to rescue the second function that I mentioned. Third, to understand the demand and supply dynamics in terms of delivering the global governance. And third, in the case of African countries, will position the UN system to correctly profile the African countries. When you say correctly profile the African countries, meaning that stop profiling the African countries as countries that are deprived in financial resources, which is not true, but trying to understand how a continent generates resources, but as enabled to mobilize. And UN 2.0 is exactly that Secretary General reform that you place the UN system as the preferred partner for African countries. And I believe that we are in the right track. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time, for coming here.
My
need to give
apologies,
you-
I need to leave. Adam.
No worries. Now, Jehu, please.
I must say the questions were very interesting. I'm going to take the last one. I think the UN was always more political, whereas G20 emerged from the financial crisis and looks at financial institutions. But as I see with Brazil and the other developing countries, it's taking on more social patterns. If I can be more honest, the G20 is more effective. That's why many of us, I'll speak for myself, I prefer interacting with the G20. So I think that's something which we need to also recognize why more civil society groups more proactively work with the G20. It's also in many ways more inclusive because of the multiple engagement tracks which are there. So I think that's another thing. So those are my reasons on why I personally, as a civil society actor, prefer to work with G20 and have done since its inception. That's my first reason. My second thing I would like to respond to, I think Bretton Woods is very good, but in a sense, Bretton Woods keeps the control of the power with the global north. So maybe we need to also be bold enough to shut down institutions which were started post-World War II and try to look at institutions which really emerge from the global south. Because I think sometimes what we are looking at, and I think that is where there is a tension in the whole development paradigm, is what we are looking at is we are trying to fit into institutions which came post-World War II, when many countries like India were still, just getting its own independence. So they have an inherent colonial structure which we need to move away from. So we need to start, if we have to really shift global governance, we need to move away from our own colonial mindsets as a colonized country or otherwise, and try to look at equitable mindsets. So I think, and that means we may have to stop certain institutions and not just try to reshape them, but even be bold enough to shut them down. So that's one of my really more bold, different way of thinking when we are looking at it. The last is I love the question of F20. And this is what I was saying. We need communities. We need the voices of the slums, the favelas into the G20 and all other processes. And my dream is that when we go to 2030 and the SDGs are done, actually the whole new document is created based on the voices of people in the favelas, on the streets, in the slums, and in the rural parts. And we leverage AI and tech to be able to get those voices to shape what we really need. And then global governance will really and truly take place. So I leave you with that thinking, and I think G20 Social is the first step to it. So thank you very much, and I apologize, I have to leave you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a safe time.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye. Now, Karin, please, your final remarks.
Thank you all very much for the very thought-provoking questions. I'll try to address them to the best of my capacity. Starting with the colleague who made the comments on the bigger pillar and the need for more capital, new capital from the shareholders. True, that's a very difficult question, a very difficult point. Lots of discussions in our conversations throughout the year. And it's a very important aspect on how MGBs will indeed help move the system from billions to trillions. We talk a lot about CAF implementation. We talk a lot about hybrid private capital mobilization. New capital is indeed a very important piece of this puzzle. But again, all means are necessary. We need to be talking about all the different measures to increase and to leverage resources to address the finance gap ahead of us. On the last question on the FFG and the G20, I think certainly one way to look at it is where the different groups sit in and relate with each other. But perhaps another way to look at it is how they interact one with another and how the different ideas and recommendations put forward combine one with another, creating opportunities for collaboration. We tend to think a lot about competition, but let's look at the not at the empty portion of the glass, but the one with the water and the opportunities ahead of us to really create a legacy as the one that I mentioned within the G20, from Italy to Indonesia to India and Brazil, in the discussion on MDB reform, and how critical the work that has been done by the previous G20 presidencies were for the G20, the Brazilian presidency, to add value and reach the point in which we are now. I think the same we can think amongst ourselves how the different processes can collaborate among themselves and take this legacy and, most importantly, action forward. Just a few, and speaking about action, two quick points on issues raised on debt and SDRs. And these are two discussions that we are having in the realm of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, which is one of the flagship initiatives by President Lula in the G20 presidency. And we are exploring very concrete instruments with multilateral development banks on how to, based on debt swaps and based on SDR rechanneling to MGBs, to finance initiatives under the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I pass to Bruno, I just want to share, Henrique, that we are organizing an event in DC, back-to-back the annuals meeting, to debate debt. And we also want to have a panel at the social summit. So it's in our calendar, but it's good that you have pointed it. Bruno, please.
Thanks, Tatiana. Let me first start with an issue raised by Jeru about the role of civil society in multilateral institutions and the need to reimagine these institutions. I think, I mean, this is, and this is actually something that early, followed up with the specific role of communities, of favelas in this process. And I've been involved with these multilateral institutions for a couple of decades. And even though we had, for example, since the early 2000s, something like the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee, if we look at the progress that has been made in the governance of these institutions, it's very little. It's very hard to move with any fundamental change because at the end of the day, the structure of power in the globe is what end up determining the space for change within these institutions. I think the hope for change comes exactly from greater participation of the civil society. I mean, we have to have pressure coming from outside. It's not easy to think of, how the multilateral institutions would be organized like around or having civil society organizations within like its governance structure. But if the civil society mobilize and bring their questions and pressure the governments and these institutions, we certainly can move in the right direction of having both more representative institutions more focused on the issues that are relevant for the people, and with more accountability. So I believe that this is the step that we need. It won't be given, it needs to be conquered. So it's something for the civil society to move in that direction. Henrique raised the issue of negotiations about that. And indeed, if we look at low-income countries especially, but some middle-income countries as well, they are suffering a lot because, we had a long period of very low interest rates. And then since the end of the pandemic, we have this process of a steep rise in interest rates. And this created an amazing burden for these countries that basically crowded out all the space for investment on social issues. So we have, and I think Henrique mentioned this, in many countries, the debt service is higher than what is being spent on education, on health, and on the most critical areas of government spending that have a direct impact on the life of people. I think during the pandemic, there was this initiative of the DSSI, which was the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. It was focused on these low-income countries. Interest rates, as I said, were very low at that moment, but of course, any relief was welcome given the pressure coming from the expenditure needs related to the pandemic. Afterwards, there was a move towards a common framework, which would be trying to bring all the different actors together to facilitate the processes of debt restructuring. We know that the landscape of the international creditors have changed in the past couple of decades, and we have new actors that are experiencing now the challenge of proceed with that restructuring and providing that relief in situations where the countries are effectively in need. And of course, it should be made in a way that the burden sharing includes effectively private creditors, because private creditors benefit from lending to developing countries at very high rates, I mean, much higher than what you're going to find in developed countries. And these high rates, they have built into them exactly the risk that is associated with these countries. So in a situation where these risks materialize, they should hold the burden of restructuring and providing relief of these debts. More recently, there was the creation of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which is along the same lines of bringing all these actors together to discuss possibilities in terms of, providing that relief. And one of the points raised is regarding credit rating agencies. And indeed, I mean, this is something that I think it's a whole agenda that we have ahead of us. There's a lot of, let's say, lack of transparency around these agencies. During, for example, the DSSI, one of the issues that were raised, even in that context of pandemic, is that, I mean, countries that will be benefiting by the DSSI would be rated as in default, and then would be paying higher interest if they wanted to come to the market. So it's something completely crazy, but that's how they ended up contributing to the effort of providing relief to the poorer countries in those conditions. Regarding SDR channeling, I think this is there is one point that I raised before. If we had a more balanced structure in terms of governance, of quota distribution at the fund, of course, when you allocate the SDRs, it will go more to countries that effectively need these SDRs. But in addition to that, and this was something that we, as a chair at the IMF board, we raised since the beginning of the discussion of this general allocation of the SDR, is that, I mean, we need to find ways in which these SDRs could flow to these countries. And this is not simple just to, say that SDRs are allocated to members, but they stay at the central bank accounts at the IMF. And you can imagine how difficult it is to take any money from a central bank account. I mean, I'm from the Central Bank of Brazil, so it's not easy. And I mean, this is something that there have been many initiatives trying to design very ingenious frameworks to facilitate that channeling, but it hasn't been, let's say, very successful because of this difficulty that I mentioned. And finally, Betty mentioned the role of the IMF for poorer countries. I think this is one of the issues that we are discussing right now, which is the concessional arm of the IMF is actually outside the IMF, which is the PRGT. It's a trust fund administered by the IMF because the IMF cannot lend on concessional terms, so at like, let's say, lower interest rates than the one that covers its costs. So, and this, there has been an amazing increase in demand for these concessional resources of the IMF. And there is an ongoing attempt to raise funds for the PRGT, but there is a huge gap now in order to assure that the PRGT will be able to meet, let's say, with certain constraints, the very high demand that we have now for that kind of resources. And unfortunately, the best solution, given the fact that, I mean, the contributions from donors have not matched the needs of funding of the PRGT, would be to sell just a small fraction of the IMF gold holdings. Because these holdings, they are valued at $35 an ounce. And I don't have the quotation now, but last time I saw a couple of weeks ago, it was being valued in the market at $2,930 something dollars an ounce. So if you take that gold, just a fraction of it, and sell, and you can sell it outside the market, it has been done in the past, you're gonna make a huge profit, and that profit could be channeled directly to the PRGT and ensure that it would meet the demand that we now have. Unfortunately, there is a very high majority to sell gold at the fund, and we couldn't reach that majority within the executive board to approve this measure. But we're still fighting for it, because the other solution, which is transferring net income from the fund to the PRGT, and this is the one that is being crafted right now, means at the end of the day that countries that are going to the fund because they are in crisis, because this is the role of the fund to lend to countries in crisis, they have to pay higher charges or surcharges than would be needed, because you need to generate that net income, so that the income that goes above the cost for the fund to lend that money, so that you can take that income and transfer to the PRGT. So in the end, it's like the middle income countries in crisis, middle and even low income countries in crisis that have to go to the general resource account of the fund, paying for the IMF lending to low-income countries. So this is not the best arrangement, as anyone can know, and we are also at this very moment trying to find a way to improve this framework in order to get a better result. Sorry for being too long here. Thank you.
No, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Bruno. And now, Flavio, please.
Let me try to be brief, as I understand we are a little bit over time. Henrique very well remembered. We have been defending debt for social programs. We have been successful in recent times with many debt swap mechanisms, debt for health, debt for climate, but there's no let's say, clear or more systematic use of debt for social programs. We would like this to be one of the features in the financial pillar of the Global Alliance against Hunger and Poverty, which we intend to be the main deliverable of the summit in November. It's not easy to be designed. I think my colleagues try to explain many of the debt discussions in the G20 currently. I think the only one point, and we didn't have it in our presidency, was the Compact with Africa, which is a finance track mechanism in the G20 created in the German presidency. One of the issues being debated there, and I think the last meeting was last year in Berlin, was the issue that some financially responsible, financially sound countries in Africa are still overburdened by high interest rates simply because they're African countries. They will have a low credit rating just because they are from that continent, which is an absurd situation, and certainly G20 governments should be doing something about it. It's a hard debate, even from the Brazilian government perspective. Our president was here this week, and he met personally several of the credit rating agencies here in New York. It's not an easy debate because it involves essentially private investors or private agencies rating the soundness of countries, countries and countries and companies. So it's not an easy debate, but it's certainly one that is worth, let's say, looking into how the G20 can help finding a solution, let's say, not to overburden countries that are being responsible, are being trying to managing their accounts in a sound way. Let me now move to Erley's question about how to involve favelas in the G20 discussions. The Brazilian presidency has been trying to be very creative and very open to civil society. There's not much that we can do. We also we depend on how other countries react to it. We did two things that were, let's say, beyond what was expected. The G20 Social Forum, one of them, which is to have a dialogue between civil society, favelas included, and the leaders, the leaders coming for the summit in November. So that's one thing that we're still preparing. But another one that I would like to stress very much was that for the first time we had a Sherpa meeting with the presence of civil society representatives. We had in the third Sherpa meeting in July a session in which representatives of the engagement groups came and presented recommendations to Sherpas. And we organized a debate between civil society representatives and the Sherpas. It's a way of, let's say, since we can't have civil society sitting with government, and I would doubt that civil society in many countries, in Brazil as well, would like to have governments sitting in their boards, let's say. That's a tricky question in many countries. We at least try to produce a framework where the government representatives, the Sherpas, which are the key representatives for the leaders process, had to pay tribute and had to explain themselves to civil society. It's a small step, but it was a step that we thought was worth taking. I don't know if we can do much more, but I thought that was, let's say, a positive contribution towards what you would like us to do. Jimena, on the deliverables and on saying more about the normalization. The normalization has taken a lot of political capital from the presidency, as you can imagine. Let's say there is the issue of how you build trust, and to build trust, if we were a country, let's say, trying to do China containment or providing weapons to Ukraine, that wouldn't be the case. We would not be able to build trust, the trust required for us to resume ministerial declarations in the G20. It wouldn't be possible to have a foreign minister's declaration, the first foreign minister's declaration yesterday in the history of the G20. So there's the trust building side, and there's also the agenda side. I think we were clever to select an agenda which is uncontroversial. Who can be against fighting poverty and hunger? Seriously. Not even in Moscow, not even in Beijing, not even in Washington. So it's an agenda which we think can get the whole group around one issue. And that is the main deliverable of November. I think November, the launching of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, I would like to say more about it. I don't think I have the time. There are three pillars. One pillar is about the social programs. Fighting, I think it was, who said, I don't know if it was Jero, I think it was Christina that mentioned poverty alleviation. There are many ways of, doing poverty alleviation. One is just being incredibly efficient and growing. That's the case of East Asia in recent times. They were incredibly efficient and grew a lot, and they removed many people out of poverty because of that. But I would argue that most parts of the planet are not as efficient, and still we have to, they would like to do something about poverty alleviation, about fighting hunger. Our case is that we need to mix a certain degree of economic efficiency, growth, and social programs that would be able to tackle poverty, or at least tackle extreme poverty. That was what worked in Brazil. Brazil managed to grow a lot from the 1930s to the 1970s, and after the 1980s, we stagnated. Our growth levels went to, let's say, from 2 to 3 at best. But then the idea that, as our president says, we need to put the rich in the tax office and the poor in the budget. That idea, the idea that we have to have social programs in place is behind the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. How do we have a set of tested social programs that could be used with the proper financing coming from MDBs, coming from abroad, but also coming from the national budgets in place for us to tackle the situation that we have 130 million more people in hunger than before the pandemic. That's a dramatic situation, and the selection of that agenda, I think, helped us, together with the trust building, produce the results that we want for November. I am much more skeptical about Brazil's second priority on sustainable development and fighting climate. I think the unfulfillment of Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, the $100 billion per year from developed to developing countries, the unfulfillment of that article and the pushback against CBDR created an environment of resentment and mistrust that I think is now presenting a cost. We wanted in our G20 to have something being done in terms of the economy-wide NDCs. Brazil has economy-wide NDCs. I think it's less than 5 other countries that have economy-wide NDCs. We will have to have new NDCs by the end of next year. February 10th. And we would like a push towards economy-wide NDCs. I don't think we'll be getting there. Brazil will provide an economy-wide NDC, most likely. I can't say for it's not out of my attributions in the government. And we will also would like to do some progress about Article 2 of the Paris Agreement on how to use the Bruno is from the central bank, how to use central bank regulation to incentivize investment in industries that help fighting climate change, and how to de-incentivize investments in industries that do not help fighting climate change, how to use the financial regulator for that. We were very ambitious when the presidency started about doing something about Article 2. I'm coming to the end of the presidency very much skeptical about it. So that's why I'm saying that the biggest deliverable will be the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, and this normalization, this contribution to global governance that I think we are being able to do in a modest way, but in an effective way as well. I think I try to answer as much as possible. Alessandro from the audience, if I may, the G20 and UN issue. I think each of the two play a different role, to be very frank. I think the UN provides a broad representation, provides the legal framework that is very, very important, whereas the G20 provides an informal global governance mechanism. Informality plays a role. It can't do anything. We need the properly structured Bretton Woods, UN, WTO institutions, but also this informality and flexibility that we have in the G20 are essential. So I think each of them play a different role, and I think we need to, let's say, bring the G20 to the UN is a good idea, but let's also know that they play different roles in international relations nowadays. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before I close and give my thank you for the IPI to host this event, I just want to say that one of the achievements of finance track was the taxation of billionaires, and now we are moving this agenda to UN. I have here, if you want, one pager for our campaign to create a UN protocol inside the UN Convention for taxation. And when we had the meeting that Jimena mentioned with global civil society, and all of them said, are you doing this in G20? And then we said, yes, because we are the presidents of G20, and then we will keep doing this to put this at the UN, to put it where we can to make it happen. So it's really, really a flag for Brazilian government, for the Minister of Finance, Fernanda Haddad. And it's really important in this moment that we are calling in that a campaign that UN will be discussing this in December and January, that we count on your pressure above your own governments to have more alliance in this agenda. So if you have interest, please talk to me when we close this session, that I can have you this one pager. So we will keep doing our best to have another international monetary system and fighting with inequality within and among nations. And I'm coming to the end. It was really, really a milestone to be here. I'm very grateful for IPI to give this support. And also, I want to thank my colleagues. It's a big pleasure, and we can work at the government that supports social participation, and then you send an invitation to your colleagues that have a busy, busy agenda, and immediately they said, yes, I will be there. So thank you for giving us your time to talk with global civil society. But at the end, I really want to thank for the audience, for the civil society. That's the reason to we be here. I think as G20 Social being coming to the end of a Brazilian experience, we really want to have this as a legacy for G20 and for multilateral institutions. So count on us to talk about this experience and to keep doing this. And I think that one of the main reasons to have it is that global economy is, the motor of global economy is made by the people. And the people who is affected by the poly-crisis scenario. So if we don't listen to you, if you don't give your inputs, we are not achieving the real results that we need to do in this kind of negotiations, of multilateral negotiations. It's the same as national level, but I think it's really, really important. So thank you for your trust. Thank you for being with us. And I hope we can keep doing this